Welcome to The Red Notes. Today's episode is about Alone, a devastating yet deeply important episode of Moral Orel. Moral Orel is known for its dark humor, but this one's different. It doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it completely shatters you. This episode isn't just a dark comedy moment, it's real. This is something that happens when society treats trauma like a joke. And Alone, Moral Orel confronts this, and it's pretty head on. We have three women, three tragedies, and three different ways that people can face trauma. Three different ways that trauma can rewire a person forever.
Sunny here, right, Sunny? Aw, you're so childy. So, are all you family hungry? Yes? I'm starvish too.
First, we have Nurse Bendy, the girl that never was. The girl who never fully got a chance to grow up. At first glance, Bendy seems quirky. And her playing with her dolls, it's cute. Women should be able to play with dolls or whatnot. But when we take a closer look, we see that she's stuck. Frozen at a certain age, the age that she was before she was assaulted, before Dr. Second Opinion destroyed her life. There's a particular scene that really grabs your attention. When Bendy is playing with her doll family, one of the dolls falls on her and she screams.
No! Honey, you can! Not you! You can! No! Oh, don't! Treat me not like everyone! Not you!
That's the sound of someone who's clearly been through it, who maybe most of the adult figures or people who she trusted have betrayed her. And now when the doll falls upon her too, she fears that the doll also only sees her as a certain thing, and it breaks her. I find the beaded luminosity of the doll's eyes to also be quite fascinating because it's almost as if the doll is not an inanimate object. It's an actual thing, a being that is looking and sexualizing Bendy, even though they're supposed to be a family. I find this artistic showing of this doll and Bendy's relationship to be quite interesting because it it portrays how assault can be, at least coming from someone who you trust or someone who's like a authority figure in your life or someone who you care about. It portrays how although you see them as someone who cares about you and someone who you love, they see you through a different lens. I find the switching between the doll's lens to Bendy's eyes and her cheerfulness seeing the dolls compared to the doll's dimmed, almost sexual viewing of Bendy to be quite interesting and also sad. It makes me think the doll did it on purpose. But I know teddy bears don't do things on purpose. They're inanimate. But the way that this is portrayed, I find it to be really interesting and also quite heartbreaking. Nurse Bendy is a survivor of statutory assault, which occurred when she was a minor. She was impregnated by Dr. Second Opinion, resulting in a child that was also taken away from her because she was literally a minor. Joe Second Opinion, her son, later finds out about what his father did to his mother and beats him up, which I am so happy about, but that's just like a little throw in for the viewer. So, what are Nurse Bendy's coping mechanisms? Regression. Bendy has psychologically regressed to a younger age before her assault as a way to feel safe. Isolation. She lives an isolated life, struggling to form genuine connections with others possibly because she doesn't trust them, and possibly because they see her as just a sexual being. Symbolic family. Bendy creates a family using teddy bears, replacing the family torn from her. Sexualization. Due to her trauma, Bendy believes that her only value lies in her body and its ability to please men, which is also why when her doll falls on top of her, she screams because she doesn't want the one family or the family that she has created to also see her the same way that the others and the public views her.
Kriebler was apprehended last March when Diorama elementary school teacher Agnes Sculptum, described as a generally disinterested human being by her students, doggedly stalked the perpetrator for several weeks, heroically sacrificing her virginity along with her naturally blonde hair in order to finally apprehend the violent, brunette-chasing Romeo.
Next, we have Miss Sculptum, the imperfect victim. She was assaulted, but she still wants the person who assaulted her, and she has fantasies and sexual fantasies about the person who assaulted her. A lot of people cannot understand this because of the whole notion of the perfect victim, but I believe that Miss Sculptum is the quintessential or my favorite display of the imperfect victim. When someone is assaulted, their trauma doesn't necessarily follow logic, it follows pain. And sometimes people's brain learns to love pain. People's brains tie pain to love as a way to cope. I mean, we saw this in Blabberta, in my analysis of Blabberta. If you haven't seen that video, go check it out. People's brains rewire in a way to make them cope and feel comfortable with whatever traumas they have been through, whether by learning to love pain, regressing, or alienation or whatnot. But it doesn't particularly follow a certain logic. It follows coping mechanisms and how to deal with the trauma that you have been through. And I really appreciate this representation because the sad truth is not everybody who was assaulted by their assaulter sees it that way. It takes some people a lot of therapy, a lot of time to finally reason and understand why do I feel this way and understand that they're not to blame, that this was something that happened to them and they're allowed to have these complex feelings about what happened to them. Miss Sculptum was assaulted and impregnated by Mr. Creepler, a serial rapist in the town. This was a traumatic event that deeply affected her psyche. At some point, she craved him, and a lot of the news headlines portray her as a saint, as someone who gave herself in order to help catch Mr. Creepler. But I think it's a really interesting dynamic of how the media tries to portray her assault. The headlines are kind of crazy, and they spell things like vigilante act, forced to print crepe. We can't ignore this anymore. 36-year-old housewife forced to have her first ... All these headlines are just wow. They don't even blame Mr. Creepler or their society for letting it run for so long. They only care, I mean, I wouldn't even say care, quote unquote care now, because they can't ignore it anymore. It's gotten to a point where they just simply can't ignore it. A pure town like Morton doesn't need such a scandal. I mean, I laugh but cry on the inside because there are so many places in this world that still adhere and believe in this type of thing. So, coping mechanisms. When Miss Sculptum finds out that she's pregnant, she tries to do a self-administered baby release. It's strongly implied that she wanted to do it through using a coat hanger. But she has conflicted feelings about this because although she has been assaulted and she doesn't want to have the baby, she's also attracted to Mr. Creepler and wants a part of him in her. It's extremely complicated. She's just a quintessential imperfect victim, but imperfect in quotation because I don't believe there's such a thing as an imperfect or a perfect victim. A victim is a victim, but we're gonna call it imperfect quote unquote victim because of the notion of perfect victim. Just to give contrast to that.
When asked how she came to catch this perverted ragamuffin, Sculptum simply stated, "I left my doors unlocked." Apparently to the glum, frumpy teacher, That action alone was far more harrowing than the actual act of savage, non-consensual sex. Reverend, back to you. You're kidding.
Another coping mechanism that I recognized from Miss Scoldham is her compulsive need to mess with the doors. She constantly locks it, unlocks it, locks it, unlocks it, double checks that it's locked because of her trauma. I wonder if this is related to some form of OCD, but I cannot diagnose. But her obsession with the door and making sure it's locked, but also wanting to unlock it, but making sure it's locked, highlight her complicated feelings towards what has happened to her. So, why does society find it hard to see women like Miss Scoldham as victims? I think it's particularly because we expect victims to be pure and strong. But again, real trauma or trauma, I don't want to even say real trauma. Trauma is messy and it's ugly. And yes, sometimes it might manifest in someone becoming stronger. Sometimes they become infatuated with the person who assaulted them. Sometimes they regress. These things can come in so many different ways. And I think that it's counterproductive to try to prop up a certain type of victim while dismissing another type of victim because they don't fit the status quo of pure and strong. So while doing some research for this episode, I came across some Reddit posts that I find extremely interesting and also just relate to what I've been saying about Miss Scoldham. A lot of people particularly dislike the fact that this was the episode that got Moral Oral canned. I am a part of people. I don't understand why this is the episode that got the show canned when there are so many other episodes that were way more like disgusting. Like this episode is not even disgusting, it's just real. It's just extremely real and that can be really hard. It's I would say it's more devastating than disgusting because it's so real, you know? It's such a good representation of different types of traumas, similar in a sense, and how people choose to deal with them. But I saw this Reddit post and I found it again interesting because it highlights the importance of letting victims just be. And again, not shaming them for not being a perfect victim. And again, Miss Scoldham feels an attraction to her assaulter. And this is a perfect example of how different essay victims can try to rationalize what has happened to them. Rather than judging, I think it's important to empathize. Not everyone is going to be a quote unquote perfect victim, and I think that's perfectly fine. A victim is a victim nonetheless of how they choose to deal or how they choose to assess their trauma, and they deserve support.
What you were talking about,
Yeah. I got it, thanks. Do you know what babies mean to God? That's right. Job security.
Bah, Patty, you fool. Someday you'll discover that little babies are the devil's scabies.
The last woman in this episode is Miss Censordoll. She's iconic for all the wrong reasons. But obsession with egg. Egg obsession. Eggception. Anyways, Miss Censordoll had her quote unquote, I'm gonna say body stolen away from her. So by her mother. So now she seeks to control everything, you know? The school, the rules, her own faith. Like, she can't have power over herself, so she'll take it from everyone else or everywhere else that she can possibly get it. Yes, she's cruel, she's hypocritical, but where's the law? She makes sense. When a world takes everything from you, I mean, all that's left is, I guess, revenge. I'm not saying I'm Miss Censordoll. I don't relate to Miss Censordoll, but sometimes I find myself understanding why the way that she is, and a society that breeds a woman like her.
Mother, I hardly think the Reverend Patty is sufficiently pious enough to even tackle the subject of original sin. Of course I'm more suited. What a question! My lack of eggs is not a hindrance. It is an asset. Don't push me down like that when you did this to me. Well, then what good was relieving me of my reproductive parts if I cannot be an expert on the matter? I was an infant when I had them. I was an infant when you had them removed. So for all intents and purposes, I am immaculate from conception. I am not holier than thou, mother. But I am holier than you.
Closing thoughts. I think a key reason why we talk about Moral Oral, or particularly this episode, 10 years, a decade later, 20 years later, 30 years later, is because, again, it's real. I find that in a lot of media, cough cough 13 reasons why, at some point the show starts to glorify the assaulter and bastardize the person who was assaulted because they weren't quote unquote a perfect victim. I think that is extremely problematic and it's horrible. It's almost like society wants to be in collusion with the one who abused versus the victim because the victim doesn't fit within the status quo of pure and strong. I think the reason why I've always gravitated towards Alone, and I enjoyed this episode even though it is a bit more graphic and a bit more out there than some of the other episodes, is because I like this representation of different types of trauma and how people can deal with their trauma. I think sometimes we're we're con- we're oversaturated with the idea of the perfect victim that we forget to seal the realness of others who quote unquote don't fit within that perfect victim orb. I really hope that in some future or in some later time we'll get more shows like Moral Oral that when they talk about assault and they talk about things like this, that they really explore it and they really show that, it's never the victim's fault. Cough cough 13 reasons why. It's never the victim's fault. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like to see some of my other content, please like and subscribe. I talk about things like this all the time. Thank you for watching.